Should the UK call for a ceasefire in Gaza? Are we at risk of being overwhelmed by migrants? And what will it take to reach a deal with junior doctors? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative peer Stuart Jackson, Labour's Shadow Minister for Skills, Seema Malhotra, Moya Lothian-McLean from Novara Media, and the Conservative commentator Tim Montgomery. Today, the UN Security Council will today vote on a resolution calling for a ceasefire following days of heavy strikes in Gaza. Is the UK's position changing?
We've been consistent, and I made this point in Parliament last week, in calling for a sustainable ceasefire.
Junior doctors are set to walk out this week and for a further 6 days in January. Can a pay deal be reached to call off the strikes?
We've got to try and negotiate a fair path for NHS staff back to fair pay, but that is going to take time.
Rishi Sunak joins with the Italian Prime Minister in warning that illegal immigration could overwhelm their countries. And the government plans to increase the amount you have to earn if you want to bring your spouse to live with you in the UK.
Can he at least offer some transitional help for families, or does his party's support for the family now only apply to the highly paid?
We'll speak to the founder of the organisation Reunite Families about whether the new rules will punish Britons for falling in love. But first of all, let's focus on what's going to be happening in New York at the United Nations later on this afternoon. There's going to be a vote on a resolution sponsored by the United Arab Emirates calling for an immediate ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, which is summed up in The Guardian with this headline: UN Security Council to vote on ceasefire call. So that's happening this afternoon. If you were reading The Telegraph this morning over breakfast, you would have seen an article from the former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace saying that Israel risks breaking the law with its, what he describes, killing rage, basically saying that Israel's actions risk undermining the legal basis for the military action against Hamas. And then if you were watching TV this morning, you might have seen these pictures which suggest some of the desperation in Gaza at the moment. These are aid trucks crossing over the Rafah crossing from Egypt and then being looted by people who are obviously pretty desperate for supplies. So that's the situation. Stuart, just help us understand the government's position at the moment, because it does seem to have evolved. This idea of a sustainable ceasefire, which is the language that Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, used in the papers at the weekend. Is that a different position, do you think?
Well, I think the difficulty is we don't really understand what it means, because some people would say a sustainable ceasefire is Hamas laying down its arms, the Israelis laying down their arms and all the hostages being released. But I don't think that's on the agenda. There was a ceasefire, of course, up until October the 7th, which was broken by Hamas in their genocidal rage in their incursion into the southern part of Israel. I do think that there is broad support for humanitarian aid, but there is a strong argument to say that any ceasefire which enables Hamas to continue to misuse international aid, as they've done in the tunnels, hundreds of millions of dollars of aid, and continue to rearm, is not a sustainable ceasefire. So in answer to your question, quite simply, I just don't think the government is settled in itself as to what a sustained ceasefire is.
Seema, what would your definition of a sustainable ceasefire be?
I think there is a change in tone, and it is important to recognise...
Towards what?
Towards calling for a ceasefire in some form. And I think whatever the words people are using, whether it's ceasefire or it's cessation of hostilities, what's clear is that there is real concern about the devastation now happening in Gaza. And that isn't to say there isn't huge concern still about what happened on October the 7th and the urgent return that we must see of the hostages. But where you see, Keir Starmer having talked about ceasefire last week and stepped towards some sort of permanent or sustainable ceasefire, the international community is calling for this. I think you're seeing it in different ways. And this is essential because there has been far too much devastation now. There are those who are saying that there's a turning point in Gaza. 250,000 homes destroyed, including relatives of my constituents, hospitals being destroyed, schools being destroyed, concern about whether even churches are now safe. And we need to see a truce again, at least, in the very least, to create the space for a dialogue, to see that there is international aid that is coming in for a very, very desperate circumstance, spread of disease and so on, and that there is going to be accountability under international law with the ICC. But if I can make this final point, it is really important that the international community works together. I want to pay tribute to the Middle Eastern countries as well for the work that they are doing, and that we stand with Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinian people are not Hamas.
You mentioned your leader, Keir Starmer. Is he going to lay out an evolution in Labour's position this week, as we're led to believe?
Well, I certainly heard what he was saying last week, and I very much hope that we see. I think the international community is working towards that, and I think that with the moves that are going on, with what Ben Wallace has written, with what Keir Starmer has said, with what David Lammy said last week, that we need to move, and Britain needs to move its position as well.
Moya, do you think the British establishment is starting to get a bit tougher on Israel, having almost given them a bit of a blank check at the start?
I don't think they're getting tougher in Israel. I think there's still a profound moral cowardice at the top of our political establishment when it comes to the situation in Israel.
That's preventing them doing what?
That's preventing them from calling for a ceasefire. They should have called for a ceasefire weeks ago. The fact that 19,000 people have been killed over under 3 months in this assault on Gaza, 1.5 million have been displaced, at least out of a 2.2 million population. They keep moving the zones of conflict further south. And you hear these statements from the top of Israeli society, from the IDF, from Netanyahu himself, which says, genocidal statements, I would say. You mentioned the word genocide there, Stuart. Well, I would say that Netanyahu's saying everybody in Gaza is a terrorist. We need to move the entire population to the Sinai Desert. You also mentioned this idea that there's a misuse of aid. I would argue that the killing of 19,000 citizens in Gaza on the back of US aid, it gives Israel about $3 billion every year in security aid and have pledged $14 billion more. Is that not a misuse of international aid to fund 80% of Israel's weapons capacity?
When Israel left Gaza in 2005, there was a functioning civil society, functioning infrastructure.
They didn't leave Gaza. There's been ongoing occupation and blockade.
They left Gaza in order for it to be a self-governing entity. And instead of spending that money on building what could have been UAE, Singapore on the Red Sea or
how can there be a UAE, Singapore on the Red Sea when the entirety of Gaza and what goes into Gaza is governed by Israeli occupation? How can they have self-government when Israel's controlling what goes in, what money goes in?
And I'm sure those will be arguments that there'll be.
The Gaza Strip entry to Israel. People were allowed to come and go. There was civil society. Where have been the elections by Hamas?
And I'm sure that's the stuff that they'll be discussing.
Freedom and civil liberties and human rights.
Do you think 19,000 people killed is a fair price to pay?
Let's pause it there because I'm going to bring in Tim as a Conservative Party watcher. What difference will Ben Wallace's intervention today have?
Ben Wallace is a hugely popular former Defence Secretary. He always topped the league table of Conservative cabinet ministers. So his voice will be listened to. I don't think he helped himself with the phrase killing rage. I think that was such a level of, I think you probably think it was moral clarity, but I think it was also very pejorative. Look, Israel has a very difficult operation to complete in Gaza. I don't think any of us who are watching the scenes coming out of Gaza can be anything other than appalled when you see human life, young human life, on this scale that we are seeing being lost. It's awful. But war is awful. And Israel is saying that if you compare the loss of civilian life that is happening in Gaza to the sort of loss of civilian life that happened in Iraq and Syria when we were trying to deal with ISIS, they say it's comparable. These operations are by their nature incredibly difficult.
But Ben Wallace does say that Israel is at risk of losing its legal authority. I think that is incredibly significant. And there is only in the end going to be a political solution to this, and also making sure that there is an end to violence on all sides. There's got to be space for that to happen. And that's why we need a truce and we need a permanent ceasefire, steps towards a permanent ceasefire.
Well, we're running out of space on the programme to talk about that important issue, but we will be coming back to it, I'm sure, over the next few days and the next few months. And we'll see what happens in the UN at lunchtime. Right, let's check out the BBC News website for news about junior doctors in England. They say they are planning 9 days of strikes after talks collapse. So the first 3 days of that strike will be on Wednesday this week, with some more in January, up to 6 days in one go. And of course, the talks are about how much the junior doctors' pay should go up by, because they say that they've been hard done by for more than a decade. Well, we can talk to a junior doctor now. It's Dr. Anna Warrington. Hello, doctor.
Hi.
Right. Just remind us what the government has offered you thus far and why it's not good enough for you to call off your strikes.
So the junior doctors are striking not just about pay, but more about the principle of restoring the NHS workforce so that we can look after our patients properly. At present, our pay has been eroded year on year. The government appears to be pursuing a policy of pay erosion until they make a credible commitment to stop that policy of pay erosion. It seems to me impossible that their recruitment ambitions to restore the NHS workforce could possibly be met.
And just to be clear, you're asking for, when you talk about pay restoration, you want a 35% pay increase.
It is shocking when you consider that junior doctors have suffered a 35% pay erosion over the last decade. At present, we've been offered something that accounts for less than a pay rise or even a sustaining pay package for more than 50% of doctors for this year alone. Restoration hasn't been attempted. And again, it's not about the pay, it's about the principle. If the government continues to apply a policy of pay erosion to doctors, how can they possibly hope to undo the extensive damage their policy has done to the workforce in the NHS?
Have you come to accept, though, that the government is just not going to give you 35%? That's just too much.
I am still hopeful that this government recognises the harm that its policies have caused to patients. At the moment, we have reduced life expectancy, increased waiting lists, and increased excess deaths on a daily basis, irrespective of strike action. The government has
probably made worse by strike action, though, to be fair.
There is no evidence at present that strike action has caused any excess deaths, but there is plenty of evidence that chronic underfunding of the NHS and workforce mismanagement will have contributed to excess deaths. And the government needs to get serious about this. It needs to restore the workforce so that there are enough of us to look after the patients. At present, there are not. The government has declared high ambitions to recruit thousands of doctors to restore the workforce. How can it conceivably recruit if it can guarantee any prospective doctors a 30% pay cut over the next decade?
If the statisticians crunch the numbers and say, actually, yeah, the junior doctor strike did lead to an increase in excess deaths, how will you feel?
Awful. There is not a single excess death which is acceptable to me. That is why I am forced to strike, because there are excess deaths every day. In the first half of this year, there are estimated to have been 28,000 excess deaths. And those weren't related to the strikes. Statistically, they are likely to be related to the government's chronic underfunding of the healthcare service.
Okay.
Isn't that shocking? Let's do something about it. Let's get enough doctors. Let's stop cutting their pay. Let's make the future of medicine in this country a viable career choice for me and my colleagues and for the patients we care for.
Right, Stuart, what do you make of what Dr. Anna's been saying there?
It's an absolute disgrace and it's nonsense. We spend £181 billion on the NHS every year, or this year, 40% on pay. The idea that cancelling or postponing 1.1 million operations is not going to have an impact and cost people's lives and everything else is complete nonsense. They need to get back around the table. They've been offered 8.8%. The problem is that what was once a respected professional representative body is now a hard left trade union. It's trying to act tough in order to get a completely unrealistic pay award. They should get back. They have a vocation, they're well respected generally as junior doctors. They need to put patients first and call off this strike. It's incredibly damaging. I think the Labour agree as well. Labour actually took some very, very important decisions in reforming the NHS between 97 and 2010. They're not going to get 35%. They're hurting the most vulnerable people and they should be ashamed of themselves.
Moya, I heard a snort of derision from you there.
I just think, why are you characterising getting fair pay as a hard left position? That's quite a disservice to the Tory party, is it not? Junior doctors in Scotland...
Because we keep
Sorry,
hearing...
Tim, can you let me finish?
No, but I think
Junior doctors in Scotland accepted a pay deal in August of 12.4% pay for 23-24. Is that not fair? That deal was settled by the devolved nations, but over here, the Conservative government keeps junior doctors immiserated, stops them getting fair pay, and the strikes will continue. They've spent millions on bringing in agency workers in the NHS to fill staff shortages. In the North West, I think the Royal College of Nursing...
Yeah, but hang on, Scottish doctors wanted 35% as well and settled for a lot less.
We're offering 8.8%. That's nowhere near even 12.4% is my point.
Yeah, but 12 is still a long way from 35.
But even if they don't get 35, we're still offering below what the Scottish doctors get, and that is insulting. The government is not making a serious attempt to actually negotiate with the junior doctors.
And they're taking they've had to find £1.3 billion in overtime payments to cover the absences of striking doctors.
But they're funding millions of pounds to fund agency workers.
That's money that's not going into frontline healthcare.
It's an example of short-term thinking that this government has, which is that instead of negotiating with strikers out of ideology, they're bringing in short-term workers. It happens with migration as well. We're bringing in workers from overseas because we have got these huge vacancies. Instead of actually funding these roles properly. But apparently that's a hard left position.
Right, let's let Tim make his point.
Look, I think everyone has sympathy for NHS staff. They served the country incredibly well during the pandemic. But you hear spokesmen from, which is why Stuart is right, you hear spokesmen from junior doctors, and again, it's not enough for them just to talk about pay. They make political points about NHS funding and about the state of the NHS. And
well, which they're a big part. They're part of it.
They can do, but
it's
more than pay. There is a political agenda. They have a policy objective in how they think the NHS should be funded. And if you look now at the British state, we have the highest tax burden in our history, and yet you have the NHS and pensions basically gobbling up nearly all of the growth of public spending. And Labour, of course, they will complain about NHS cuts, but you ask them what they're going to do about it, they have no tax rise plan of any kind. What we have to do is we have to live within our means. And junior doctors will not get a better deal under Labour because Labour, while they complain and moan about spending, no, there isn't more in the pot to be spent.
I think
complain and moan away, Seema.
With all due respect, Tim and Stuart, I think we have to be so careful about the language we use, and particularly as politicians. There is no need to try to be inflammatory here. I think we need to also, in terms of criticisms and going beyond the issue, to make this party political in a way that it is not. It is about our hard-working staff in our NHS. It is about the future of the NHS. It is about the crisis that the NHS is in, and it is absolutely right to say...
Turn those words into a number.
It is absolutely right to say that it is absolutely right to say that there is a crisis in the NHS that was prior to the strikes. What is really, really important to recognise is that it has been under the Tories' watch that we have seen the longest junior doctor strike in the history of the NHS. Nobody wants to go on strike. That's what doctors have told me. And it is really important that the government stays around the table and gets back round the table. There hasn't been a history of the government doing this. There needs to be a solution. You're right about... it's been incredibly difficult, and you will know that under Steve Barclay it was particularly bad, and very little meeting over time.
You're not offering any concrete proposal at all.
You haven't mentioned the word patience.
One at a time, one at a time.
We have said, and you're right, actually, the strike does affect patients, and it is very important to recognise, because none of us want to see the millions of appointments affected. But we have said, and we've been honest, that we wouldn't promise the 35%, but that doesn't mean you're not around the table.
34%, 33%, 38%.
And well, we're not negotiating, are we? But the point is here that you need to have a process and one of trust and respect between government and the NHS and those who are negotiating. I didn't hear respect today, I'm sorry to say, in the dialogue that we've just had. There needs to be respect. There needs to be a much more of a fit-for-purpose industrial relations, fit for our modern times. And I think an investment in the NHS that we have said with ending non-dom tax status and other matters. But let's say this as well. Let's make sure that there is a dialogue here that looks to our record as well. There was not a single national strike in 13 years under Labour, and that wasn't because there weren't tough times.
It was because
there was respect and there was long-term planning together. Respect and long-term planning together.
OK, let's go back to Dr Warrington. Anna, the strike in January that's pencilled in is for 6 days. Why is it OK to have that length of strike when the previous ones have been half that?
Look, I'm really disappointed by the quality and nature of the conversation your panellists have contributed. They have not paid point, which is that the healthcare system is already in crisis. These aren't junior doctors who are after a pay rise because they want to go on a sunny holiday.
Answer my point about the length of the next strike.
These are doctors who are committed to the care of their patients. It's time the government got serious and around the table to discuss solutions to the healthcare workforce crisis that they themselves have generated. We've been available all year to have meaningful discussions to solve this issue. It's them who's pushed us to consider this in the middle of winter.
Why is a 6-day strike okay?
We need to do what we can to force the government to take this issue seriously. This is ultimately in the interests of patients. We want to do our job properly. There need to be more of us. To have more of us, you need to have a financial settlement that makes a career like mine financially viable into the future. At the moment, if I'm staring down the barrel of another 35% pay cuts over the next decade, that becomes non-viable for me. And people like me will look for careers outside of healthcare within the NHS. It's just simple that will happen. So the government needs to pay attention, recognise what it's doing to damage patient care and patient safety. And if no doctor takes this decision lightly, but we will need to strike to force the government to come to the table. They have made us do that.
Anna, are you feeling any optimism about the new year and when the talks resume?
I'm always optimistic that someone sensible will come from the government and have a positive discussion with us.
And also, just not to delve into your finances, but are you coping financially with not being able to do all this work?
There is plenty of evidence that junior doctors are using additional shifts to make their ends meet. We all are paid a fixed amount, which is widely visible on the internet should you search our contractual terms. But there's plenty of evidence that many of us are having to do more work to make ends meet, as are many other people across this country at present. But it's not about my personal finances or indeed anyone else's. This is about having enough doctors to do the job to look after our patients in this workforce, in this health service. And at the moment, we don't have enough of us. And what we need is a viable and attractive package so that we can recruit the missing doctors and restore the NHS so that we can deliver patients the care that they need and deserve.
Anna, thank you very much for joining us on Politics Live today. Stuart, do you think this is coming at a political cost to the government now? You're clearly very angry with the doctors and you think they're negotiating in bad faith, but how do you think the voters perceive this? How do you think they allocate the blame?
Well, I think the voters are understanding that there has to be long-standing reform under any party because we've got a demographic time bomb. We've got issues around, for instance, obesity, stroke, heart disease, all the other things that are endemic with an older population. And every party's got that challenge. And I just think this is a very unhelpful distraction. If money isn't the issue, then why don't the junior doctors in England and Wales match the Scottish offer and accept that there has been progress and perhaps come back next year?
The government in England's offering less than the government in Scotland did.
They've had 8.8%, which is twice the rate of inflation.
And is less than the Scottish government offered.
I don't believe the figures of 35% reduction in pay over the next 10 years. I think we've increased the number of doctors and nurses. I think the government has a strong record, but we cannot shy away from fundamental reform of the health service for much longer.
Let's increase the number of subjects we're discussing on the programme today. We're going to talk about migration now, because Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, was in Italy over the weekend, where he made some quite striking comments, according to the Independent newspaper. They summarise it as Rishi Sunak says migrants threaten to, quote, overwhelm the UK. This was Rishi Sunak in Rome, visiting the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who is hosting a big political festival. There they are. Lots of hugs and kisses. Tim, those two are actually turning out to be really good mates, aren't they, politically?
Oh, well, the same size, so Rishi can actually look sort of the right height.
I think it's based on just more than a meeting of heights, isn't it? So
but no,
let's not be heightist.
There's definitely an ideological sort of sympathy there as well. And Italy is a country that itself is facing massive migration issues and is sort of feeling unloved and unsupported by the rest of the EU. And lots of people say, if only we'd stayed in the EU, we would have had more cooperation from other EU states on the migration issues that we face. Well, I think Italy will say it doesn't really work like that. It's not as simple. And we're often quite parochial, I think, in some, how we discuss British politics. The fact is, across the West, France, the president there, Macron, has said that this issue could break Europe. So lots of rhetoric is being used that upsets people, but rather than focus on the rhetoric, which I think is largely quite tame, actually, let's focus on the underlying issue. And the fact is, if mainstream parties don't tackle the migration crisis that we face, voters who want control will turn to extreme parties. That is the lesson throughout history, and it's a very dangerous lesson if it's ignored.
Although I'm interested that you think tame language is the word overwhelm. Like, being overwhelmed, that's quite a blood-curdling kind of threat, isn't it?
Well,
or prediction.
I think language is, we all have different levels of tolerance, I suppose, for language. Overwhelm doesn't seem great to me when actually the number of 700,000 people coming in net into the UK.
Well, that's legal migration. He's talking about illegal migration.
Yes, well, the whole picture, though, is what voters feel, and they feel that 700,000, when actually they were told by the Conservative government that they would reduce net immigration to the tens of thousands. It is one of the biggest breaches of trust made by any political party, the Conservative Party's record on immigration, and it's probably the biggest reason why the Tories face a rout at the next election. So, understandable that Rishi Sunak is trying to address this issue, but far too late.
Moya, why are you sighing?
I'm sighing because, first of all, I think if you tolerate that sort of language, it says a lot about your political position and the normalisation of far-right rhetoric in our political conversation. I think, secondly, the idea that we're describing it as illegal migration is so disingenuous. It's irregular. Well, first of all, there's irregular migration, which is when people come in small boats, which is the issue that the Tories have chosen to put front and centre. That is a very small part of overall migration. You mentioned net migration there, Tim, which is legal migration. The only illegal migration there is if someone has their asylum claim refused. The majority of asylum claims are accepted, and they're on appeal. I think the majority is also accepted. So if you look at the figures of people coming into the country, the majority of it is legal, and it's the reason the migration has gone up in this country is because we Brexited so catastrophically and chaotically, and we hadn't sorted out any sort of migration issue. We cut down on safe and legal routes as well, and we need loads more workers to fill in shortages. So the Conservatives are once again promising one thing: we're going to bring migration down, we're going to do this, but they know they can't do that. They are lying to the public again and again and again. And commentators like you are ramping it up.
But the point that Rishi Sunak is making in his speech in Italy is that if you've got your existing asylum system and you're saying, OK, most people come, claim asylum, they get it, you're saying that's a good thing. But under that system, if you increase the volume of people coming, which lots of people think is going to happen, you will get to numbers that the British public might find is unsustainable.
What's sustainable about our current system, though? That's my question. What's sustainable about having a huge backlog where people are waiting over 6 months to have their claims processed? The number of people who came over on small boats last year was 46,000. That is a tiny, tiny drop in the ocean. It's the same thing with the spousal visas. I think that was something like 65,000 when it comes...
We'll come on to that in a second.
Adam,
Right, hang on.
Adam, I've been accused of ramping up rhetoric. I tell you, the problem here isn't people like me who try and draw attention to a problem. It's those who say that we don't have a problem
As if there's
at
not
all.
enough attention
I thought
to the idea of
I thought you
migration.
didn't like people talking over
No,
other
you do it
people.
anyway, so I'm going to give you the same respect.
OK, right, you two, you can both chill for a second and I'll ask Stuart.
Well-
Is Rishi Sunak right that actually illegal migration is a risk to the country and we could be, quote, unquote, overwhelmed?
Well, I think where I've had slight sympathy with Labour is that this is a bit of a sideshow. The numbers aren't huge. What is concerning, and I have to come back to previous debate, I mean, this is the sort of language we get that you're hard, right and extreme because you want safe borders and a fair and equitable immigration system. And you actually think there should be appropriate allocation of resources to all strata of society, not just the wealthiest people that can afford to employ immigrants in their business or in their everyday life. That's fairness. It's not hard. And I'm afraid you're in a bubble if you think it's hard, right and extreme to bring up immigration. Because if you want the BNP and other real extremist organisations to prosper, you keep demonising those that bring up the issue. And I've seen it. If you think net migration in 1997 was 100,000, in 2010 it was 294,000, it's now 672,000. That isn't a problem and people aren't going to notice. I think you're mistaken.
Sorry. As Conservatives who've done that. I didn't say anything about I want fair and equitable migration as well.
I didn't blame a party.
Fantastic.
My party's in the wrong on this. My party has failed.
So how are we disagreeing?
We're disagreeing because
What
your
disagree on?
attitude...
I want fair and equitable
Hang on, let him
migration
answer.
too.
You just asked him.
Your attitude seems to be that those people that legitimately raise this issue, which is number 4, I think, now in voter salience, Labour voters, Conservatives, even Liberal Democrats, are somehow bad people for bringing this issue up. It is, of course, a massively important issue. We've seen a huge increase, for instance, in dependence. We've discharged, as a country, an enormously welcoming approach, second only to Sweden, for refugees from Ukraine and Hong Kong and Syria. We've got a lot to be proud of. But don't demonise those of us who think it's a legitimate concern.
I demonise the language used around it, such as overwhelm, this idea of invasion.
Do you know what? Right.
Come in on the language.
Just pause you all there.
That says something about
I want to come in on the language.
I'll come to you in a second. Is there a level of a number that you think actually the country couldn't cope with? Like,
No, why would I put a number on it? I'm not in charge of.
Because there's
the
limited
numbers.
resources, there's limited houses, there's limited space in the healthcare system.
Imagine if we were talking about building more houses rather than constantly going back to this idea of these languages of overwhelmed. I do think we should talk about migration.
So what, the UK could cope with like 5 million immigrants one year.
Oh, Adam, I'm not going to put a number on how many people should be allowed.
Just say no, that's not a good idea. Just say 5 million is probably not a good idea.
I think
can we go back to this idea of language?
OK, right, Seema, make your point. Make your point.
Better to have a more balanced debate than this. I do think that it was more inflammatory language that Rishi Sunak was using. There is absolutely a need to make sure that we have a managed and controlled immigration system. All governments will need to have that responsibility. And there has been a problem under the Tories with how the system has been managed. And I think we should recognise as well that what Rishi Sunak is saying is coming after a week in which he has failed to convince his own backbenchers or Parliament that he has a proper plan to deal with.
Except he did convince them because
it went through with in the sense of it got through a second reading. But the point is that we've also seen 600 boats cross this year. Those were the figures over the weekend. And I think everyone can see that what's happening with the Rwanda strategy is no more than a gimmick in terms of the impact it's going to have. That's why we've actually said you need to have a debate about the proper ways in which you might be able to have some effective control. Better cross-border policing, much better than we've got right now, with better powers. We haven't had a history, particularly over the last period, of working constructively and closely with our neighbours, and to make sure that we're cracking down in a much tougher way, in my view, on the criminal smugglers. I mean, it is the people who are being smuggled and trafficked. They are also putting their lives at risk here, and we need to see more international security arrangements with Europol and so on, as well as tackling the backlog. Look, all of those issues and the fact that we have a backlog the scale that we do, and the fact as well that under the Tories, you will know this, Adam, I'm sure, that asylum returns have dropped by 50%. There is a system that is broken, and no matter how much the Tories and Rishi Sunak look to blame someone else, that will always have to come back to how well are they managing the system, and it is not well at all.
Well, if you look at the Guardian website, they're looking towards the next election, and they've got this headline saying that Nigel Farage plans to return to help Reform UK make election about immigration. Reform UK being the party that Nigel Farage helped to establish. Tim, what do you think it's going to become an election about migration? Like this week, it sort of feels like it might.
I think that's a large part of what's motivated Tory debate on this issue in recent weeks. The Tory party know they're in trouble at the next general election, but the thought of Nigel Farage coming in, standing in all the marginal seats against them, turns the prospect of defeat into a rout. And we know, really, Nigel Farage's number one issue is immigration. Immigration is, I think Stuart mentioned it was number 4 in the opinion polls. I've seen, polls where it's number 2 or number 3 issue, and it certainly is amongst a lot of Conservative voters. So Nigel Farage is probably could turn the next general election into defining defeat for the Tories, and that's what's motivating a lot of this.
You'd probably love it if Nigel Farage came back, because it makes life harder for your opponents.
Well, I think we've got to focus on the issues that really matter to people, and on the NHS and on our public services, and we need to make sure that we've got a plan for getting immigration under control and having a fair and managed system. I think we should be able to do that within the politics that we have, and that requires responsibility on all sides in Parliament, that we don't see a ramping up of the rhetoric, and we do see a move to solutions.
Stuart, would you support a big international renegotiation of things like the Refugee Convention? Because that's what Rishi Sunak was hinting that he and Giorgia Meloni are going to push for.
I think it's inevitable, because it's not just a UK issue, irregular or illegal migration. It's across Europe. Germany, Italy, Spain and France, they're all having these issues. And I therefore think the 1951 Refugee Convention is hopelessly out of date. We've got to look at a modern world where we've got the internet, we've got international jet travel, etc. I would finally say to Seema, with all due respect, it's all very well bromides, warm words, butter no parsnips. Let's see some Labour concrete.
Our record also spoke for itself, and yours has spoken.
You haven't been in office
for
for 14 years. What is your policy for the general election, instead of complaining about how awful the Tories are?
And you can explain to me why asylum returns have dropped by 50% under the Tories.
Well, are you going to increase the Home Office budget? Are you going to increase the prison estate budget? Are you going to give more money to the French?
How many times has Yvette Cooper laid out what we're going to do in Parliament? Perhaps you haven't been there for any of it.
I've
listened. He's in the Lord, different chamber. Different chamber.
But I was there for 12 years.
You don't have to be in the Commons to know what's happening in the Commons.
But
or what's repeated in the Lords.
It's widely accepted that the Labour Party do not have a coherent policy for this,
other
than to criticise.
Well, you know what?
I may even support your policy when you eventually come.
Okay, this debate is getting as big as this table. Let's zoom it down into one particular aspect. So when James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, was talking about changes to legal migration a couple of weeks ago, one of the things he spelled out was increasing the salary threshold, so the amount you have to earn if you want to bring in a spouse from abroad into the UK. It's now, from next spring, going to increase to £38,700. Somebody who's very annoyed about that is a campaign group, which, according to The Guardian, is going to launch legal action over the UK's cruel income threshold visa rules. And that campaign group is called Reunite Families. And one of their representatives is Caroline Coombs, who's here. Hi, Caroline.
Hello.
What's so awful about increasing the salary threshold?
Well, we know from our membership, we've got quite a large membership of people who are wanting to be active in the campaign space for this. And we have a lot of people who don't even meet the current threshold, and a lot of women who are juggling work and childcare, for example, young couples, people who are reaching retirement or are at retirement age. And people who aren't able to get full-time work and aren't able to meet the current threshold. So to whack it up to 38,700 overnight with no...
Well, it's not overnight, is it? It's with several months' notice.
Well, we haven't had any... It got put out into the press and a statement was made, and we don't know how that figure was reached. We don't know what impact assessment has been done. We expected, it has been time since it's been increased, but to double it is absolutely crazy.
Okay, so that's your argument. What form is your legal action going to take?
So at the moment, we're trying to get further information from the Home Secretary as to what equality impact assessment was done and how the new rules are going to affect families who are already here or those who are going to be coming here before the change. And also the discrimination against certain cohorts of people who are going to be disproportionately affected by the rules. So some examples I've already given: single mums, young couples, those in retirement age, those that can't work full time, can't even meet the current threshold. So how on earth are they going to meet 38,700? We just don't know. But we've got a lot of very, very worried, upset and galvanised people who are sat here wondering what they do. There's no detail. So the government will be going home for Christmas with their families, whilst our families don't know if it's going to be the last Christmas together here in the UK, or if they're ever going to have Christmas together as a family.
Surely if their spouse is already in the UK, they're okay.
We don't know that for sure yet. Statements have been made, but nothing's written down. So we can't, until it's in black and white, our families are still feeling huge amounts of uncertainty, as are we.
Stuart, does the Conservative government really want to be in the business of splitting up families?
No, of course not. And I am hugely sympathetic to the plight of many of these folk, because it is a function of the fact that the government thus far has let things go. I think the last year, 246,000 dependents came to the UK, which is hugely larger than it has been for many, many years. And I'm sorry about that. But the fact of the matter is that it shouldn't be incumbent upon the UK taxpayer to fund through benefits and allowances the lifestyle choices of people coming to the UK. If people are coming here to do childcare, to work part-time or full-time, to contribute, to learn English, to be part of our society, then we would be crazy not to support those people. But we have to have a level which makes a value judgment on that.
Yeah, but the situation you end up in is you can only be rich if you want to fall in love with somebody who is from abroad.
Well, I think before I comment on that, I'd like to say that you probably need to look at regimes across the world, whether it's Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the United States. I think they do have
I think this is going to make the UK the second toughest in the world.
But, well, look, we are, in terms of soft power, a world power. People come here because of the English language, our time zone, our business, our entrepreneurial, regime.
But so not our marriage market.
No, it's a popular place to come, and perhaps the fees should reflect that
Okay.
once you're here, you can make a great life.
Seema, I noticed that Labour have sort of supported the idea of increasing the salary threshold, but not up to 38,700. What would be a good level?
What we've said is that there's a long-standing principle first, isn't there? That if you want to bring family here with you, then you should be able to support them. And
So what's a good
and there
level?
has, but I think, I mean, this is for the Migration Advisory Committee to look at. I think if I can just make this point, that is understandably causing a lot of concern for families, because it's a very steep increase in a very short space of time. I think you've highlighted that in the discussion, and it is the reason why we've said that the Independent Migration Advisory Committee should be looking at this, and that's our concern. We do recognise the impact that it's having in this short space of time.
Moya, should there just be no salary threshold at all? You could bring in whoever, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, from wherever, whatever you earn.
You suggested me go back to free movement, because I would love to go back to free movement, Adam. I think it's a real shame that they're increasing the salary threshold to a level that is above the median average pay of a UK worker, and this will disproportionately affect the groups that I mentioned. You know, especially as a young woman thinking about the gender, for my full-time job, I make under that salary threshold. And I think about the gender pay gap, and I think about who this is disproportionately going to impact. And as a young person, it feels like a further strangulation of the options open to me in the world. It makes Britain much smaller again, and it constricts the things that are open to me. And that's sad. I think that's sad. I think just on a basic level, this is another tightening of the options open.
Tim, very quickly, I was chatting to a Tory MP on Newscast, the podcast the other day there, and he sounded very lukewarm about this. Do you think it'll end up happening, or do you think enough Tory MPs will go, oh, this is mean?
Yeah, I think it'll be moderated, actually. It won't be as stark as it currently is. And I think there has to be a difference between those people already here who I think we have an obligation. We can't change the rules halfway through. And those, I think, probably will need to send a tougher message for the future. Because after all, there are people, British people now at the moment, who can't afford a home because of the pressure that immigration puts on house prices. I agree with Moya, we do need to build more homes, but at both and at the same time.
OK, right, we've run out of time on this episode of Politics Live, but there will be another one coming along tomorrow, and I'll be back in the hot seat again. Thanks for everyone in the other seats today.